Well, we are going to get started. Welcome to Bridge Elections FAQ, a live discussion where we discuss the upcoming election. I'm Isabel Lohman, the education reporter at Bridge, Michigan. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan news outlet, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. We have Bridge, Michigan Deputy Editor Jonathan Oosting, reporter Lauren Gibbons, and Bridge Detroit Managing Editor Christine Ferretti here to help. We'll talk about the U.S. Senate race in Michigan, problems with Detroit voting, and the Democratic National Convention. If you have a question for our reporters, you can drop them in the YouTube chat and we will see them and answer those questions. We are recording this event, and if you miss part of it, you can see the full recap on our website, bridgemi.com. Jonathan, let's start with you. It's the Democratic National Convention. It's this week in Chicago. It feels more like a coronation. Are there any surprises we should watch out for?
Well, you're right that it does seem like a coronation because, spoiler alert, Kamala Harris and Tim Walz have already been nominated by delegates to the DNC convention. They did so virtually by a virtual vote a couple weeks ago. So this week is really going to be ceremonial. Tim Walz and Kamala Harris have to accept the nominations for it to become official. But these conventions, well, first of all, we faced the potential that this year's Democratic convention was going to be super interesting. Obviously, Joe Biden ended his re-election bid, and for a couple short hours, anyways, it seemed like maybe there would be a contested convention in Chicago. But that is not the case. Of course, Biden endorsed Harris and Democrats have rallied behind her. And as I mentioned, already voted to nominate her. So what you're going to see is, a lot of pomp and circumstance this week. Democrats are going to host a number of caucus meetings during the day where different, the African American Democratic Caucus, the LGBTQ Democratic Caucus, the union caucuses will meet and hold meetings during the day. And then at night, it's very much primetime television. These events are designed to be televised. There's going to be big speeches from Hillary Clinton, a blast from the past, Barack Obama, and then, of course, Harris and Walz. We do not yet know at the time of this taping exactly who from Michigan is going to be speaking, but I would expect to see some folks like Governor Whitmer having a pretty big presence at the DNC in some capacity. She is there, as are the Secretary of State Jonathan Benson, the Attorney General Dana Nessel, and a whole host of other Democratic officials. So you're going to see a lot of them around at different meetings, if not on the stage this week in Chicago. The big drama might be outside the convention. The pro-Palestinian movement of protesters are expected to have a sizable presence in Chicago, perhaps even work their way into the convention. There are 2 uncommitted delegates from Michigan because of the number of uncommitted voters in the Democratic primary back in February. So to the extent there's going to be drama, probably outside with those folks.
That's good to know. I was just talking with a friend over the weekend about he's in Chicago and sort of what to expect. So we'll keep an eye out on that. Republican vice presidential candidate JD Vance has said that Kamala Harris has repeatedly changed her position on several policies. She did unveil her economic plan last week. Can you walk us through that and tell us how it was received?
Yeah, so this was the first big policy proposal from Kamala Harris since she became the nominee of the Democratic Party for the presidential race. She, of course, ran for president herself back in 2020 and had a bunch of positions at that time, but her campaign now, since she's running for president again, have largely backed off some of those, honestly, more liberal positions, single-payer tax, single-payer health care, stuff like that, and trying to get into the meat and potatoes. Obviously, the big issue that Trump and Republicans are trying to run on is inflation, the cost of everyday goods and houses. Inflation, of course, has slowed down, but the cost of groceries is still undeniably higher than it was just a few years back. Same with housing. So Kamala Harris has a couple things. The one thing she wants to cap or deter price gouging in the retail sector. That proposal, Democrats, even some Democrats, were a little hesitant to embrace it fully. Critics, of course, were quick to call it price controls and compare it to, communism or socialism. Some of her other proposals, I think, were more well received broadly amongst Democrats in particular. For instance, an expansion of the child tax credit. That's something that the Biden administration did during COVID, and there is some research to suggest it had pretty positive impacts on folks at the lower end of the economic spectrum. And then also another, key proposal was first-time tax incentives for home buyers, so new home buyers, to try and help people get into the housing market out of apartments maybe and into a home for the first time. So those proposals, I think, were more broadly received. I mean, even on the price gouging stuff, even, Governor Whitmer was on Meet the Press this weekend, and the host asked her whether she supported that, and she was hesitant to actually endorse that proposal, and instead gave some talking points about, the goal of the Harris campaign to try and, help average folks at home. So, Governor Whitmer was more complimentary of the overall tone than that specific policy proposal.
And with just a couple months left before the actual election, it'll be interesting to see if the Harris team nails down on the specifics or speaks more broadly. Trump will be in Howell Tuesday, and he's expected to speak on crime and safety. Christine, how would his plans affect Michigan residents?
Hi, Isabel. I think it's some of the things I've heard in terms of the policy recommendations, from Trump have been kind of interesting in terms of, one key thing would be to kind of soften a little bit on, the crackdown on officers accused of misconduct. I think that's one of the strategies that's been raised, and maybe not, be as forceful with those things. And I think that might not be received too well. And there's talk about like stop and frisk and things like that, different policies that have been really contentious in Michigan, especially Detroit. Like when you talk about the murder of George Floyd and looking back on protests in the city about, police handling of that and other things similar, other cases like that. I don't know how that would play out in Detroit if those are some of the things that rise up in terms of safety. And of course, we have a lot of conversation about, border protections and his policies there versus what the Biden administration has done. And therefore, in turn, as he's lifted up, Harris's position on that and how he feels she's carried that out, and looking at, kind of her performance with those things. So I think those are a lot of the key things that I've heard discussions about. I don't know if anybody else has additional things to add in that realm.
Yeah, I'll jump in. JD Vance was in Michigan a couple weeks ago he was in last week as well, but a couple weeks ago to talk about crime as well. His remarks were largely focused on criticizing Kamala Harris for at one point, I think it was back in 2020, it was during the protests of 2021, offering some sympathetic remarks about the defund the police movement. Of course, that wasn't specifically, just about ending funding for police, but diverting some of those funding to other sort of intervention strategies that might help, get to the root cause of crime. But, Republicans are going to bring that up a lot. I'm sure Donald Trump will as well. And then also, as Christine noted, a really heavy focus on immigration. There have been, some theft rings in Metro Detroit that have been linked to immigrants who may have entered the country illegally. And there's been a few instances of high-profile crimes that Republicans have really seized on to try and paint this picture of, the border crisis directly impacting Michigan. folks who we've talked to have said, on the whole, undocumented immigrants are still, according to data, less likely to commit serious crimes than other folks. But, Republicans have a number of high-profile incidents that they can point to and will point to and have pointed to, and I assume will continue to point to as Donald Trump comes to town this week.
Thanks for that. We had a reader who asked what Michigan leaders can do about illegal immigration. There's a state program where immigrants can get up to $500 a month to pay for housing. It goes for up to a year. Is that program providing funding to people who have come to the U.S. illegally?
Yeah, I can speak to that. So state officials have really pushed back on claims that the subsidy program in place benefits people living in the country illegally. As has been talked about already, it's been a subject of a talking point both by Trump and state level Republicans like House Republican leader Matt Howell. So state officials have said that this program comes from federal dollars and is only available to legal residents who meet federally mandated eligibility requirements. The pushback from that on the Republican side is there's concern that that legal definition might include someone who was caught living in the country illegally, who may now have a pending application for asylum. So there's still a lot of concern, especially among Republicans, about the rental subsidy program, although state officials have, pretty strongly pushed back against claims that it is housing illegal immigrants.
Thanks for that, Lauren. In Detroit, primary results were delayed because of a firewall issue that meant election workers had to physically bring their votes to downtown Detroit. That led to a delay. Christine, are you concerned that these issues could happen again?
Yes. I think there's always concern about, this being a potential problem. I feel like there's common themes, that have arisen with Detroit. I mean, we saw, some issues with delayed totals and overnight counting of absentee ballots. That was part of the central problem with election interference claims from 2020, right? So, we saw in this case that there were about 10,000 absentee ballots that were delivered on election day. So it took more time to process and tabulate those. Elections officials said, while this occurred, it did not have any issue hampering, the validity of anything we've processed. But I think you got to really be cautious because one, it has and will continue to be a talking point, of the Republican side of things, the stop the steal discussions, like that stuff is still very much, continuous. People still continue to talk about that and they will seize, I think, any opportunity of potential impropriety with processing or, getting information. And another thing that really is a challenge is with Detroit elections officials, there was a small amount of information available, but like from our own inquiry, from our staff, we still hadn't really, even to this day, I don't think we were able to hear back about more specifics. So I think they need to definitely be front facing with people like us in the media about what's happening. I mean, things happen. There are hiccups and challenges that do arise with processing ballots and like you said, technical issues, but you really have to be upfront, clear about that, front facing to the public. You can't wait for us to come to you, to get the answers. I think that's a key, being visible, being out there and back in your office and explaining the circumstances, because I do think people would be looking toward any opportunity they have to, call a perceived foul on something like this.
Yeah, let's be clear. Two things can be true at the same time. One, there probably wasn't massive fraud in Detroit in 2020 that cost Trump the election, but Detroit does have a history of election administration issues, including precincts being out of balance in 2020, for instance, where they have a different number of ballots, physical ballots, than folks, who are marked as having come in to vote. Usually that's a very small discrepancy, but it happened in many precincts. I will note that improved in 2022. There was almost no out of balance precincts during the gubernatorial election for Detroit. So that's a positive sign for election administration. And as far as election night results, to Christine's point, obviously delayed results in 2020, not just in Detroit, but Grand Rapids, for instance, too, some of the larger cities, did allow, theories to fester or whatever, materialize, develop during that gap. It is always going to take longer for the bigger cities to count absentee ballots in particular. The state did make some changes in law. So this year, larger cities can not only open absentee ballots early, I think it's like a week before the election, they can actually feed absentee ballots into a tabulator machine. They can't hit the compute button and get any results, but they can essentially have those queued up and ready to be counted on election day once they get the green light. But that doesn't address the situation that Christine mentioned of absentee ballots that come in on election day. Those can be left in drop boxes or in local offices around the city. And then they have to be physically transported to the counting board for them to then be fed into the tabulators and computed. So, it's always going to be an issue for bigger cities. But perhaps that law, the Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson was optimistic that that law would help somewhat with faster reporting results. But, the primary we saw in August, the Detroit, Wayne County, again, was one of the one of the slowest in the state, at least among counties that people were closely watching. And it's an interesting juxtaposition because right next door in Oakland County is like always the first to report results. So, it'll be something that we'll keep a close eye on in the general election.
Yeah, and to Jonathan's point, the clerk, Janice Winfrey for Detroit, has said, she has said publicly, at meetings that the elections will be safe and secure. She has vowed that to be, the goal and the stance of her administration for elections. So, hopefully, there'll be a lot of policies in place that will prevent or minimize these types of hiccups going forward. To the extent that it's possible.
Christine and Jonathan, you both touched on this idea that in the lack of information, that's the perfect time for theories to emerge, for misinformation to emerge. What's the role of the press in fact-checking those in real time and then asking questions of officials to ensure that it was a free and fair election?
Well, obviously, it's our role to do that as much as possible. As Christine mentioned, sometimes that depends on how open the election officials are going to be themselves. If they're not offering any official explanation, it can sometimes be hard to put conspiracy theories or what have you into context. So at the state level, the Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson's office is attempting to have more of a rapid response type of a setup. But, Michigan's elections are super decentralized. We have, I think, 1,400 clerks or something like that across the state. Each one of them operates, mostly independently. So, it can really vary by jurisdiction how communicative those folks are and how responsive they are to questions or theories that might arise during an election night or the days that follow.
Gotcha. Lauren, you've been closely following the race between Elissa Slotkin and Mike Rogers. They're both running for the open U.S. Senate seat. First, how have the two candidates pitched themselves to voters?
Yeah, I think in the primary results earlier this month, we saw it was sort of a proxy battle between Elissa Slotkin and Mike Rogers, and now it is official. They are running against each other after the primary results. And largely, we have seen the debate so far hover around costs. Mike Rogers, in particular, has really focused on the high costs of groceries and inflation and the impact on average Michigan residents. And Elissa Slotkin has largely been concerned with the costs of, things like childcare or education or housing. And she's kind of pitched an opportunity agenda to try and reduce those costs and make it a little easier on people. So I think a lot of what we've seen so far, at least, has been some of these pocketbook, kitchen table, whatever, election term that you want to use. That's been the focus so far. We have seen a number of statewide ads go up for both Slotkin and Rogers. Those are both campaign ads, but also attack ads from from national groups who are also trying to have an influence in this race. So there will be a lot more that we'll be hearing from both these candidates. There are talks in the works to have a series of debates. We'll see if those pan out, but that's apparently something that both candidates have expressed interest in doing.
Thanks for that. We also have about 10 weeks left to the election. We had a reader question about Mike Rogers' residency in Florida and Michigan. And then there was also a report over the weekend that suggested that Elissa Slotkin wasn't paying her fair share of taxes on her farm in Holly. Lauren, can you give us a little bit more info?
Sure. Yeah. So the Mike Rogers residency question, I actually did an elections FAQ post about on Bridge a couple of months ago. He did have a residence in Florida. He lived there. He lived there full time for a couple of years. Following his retirement, he was registered to vote there. But once he declared he was running for Senate, he did move back to Michigan and is registered to vote in Michigan. So he is here and is a registered voter. And certainly he also lived here while he was in Congress. The Florida move was after he was retired and not representing Michigan voters anymore. As for the Slotkin story that was recently posted, it was, I believe, the New York Post had an article about her Holly residence, which is a farm, getting some tax exemptions. And there were concerns raised that because it wasn't active farmland, that it wasn't being used as a farm, that it perhaps shouldn't be used for these tax exemptions. The Slotkin campaign, in a response to that article, said that it was, confirmed with Oakland County that everything was above board. But I do think that on both counts, perhaps we will continue to hear more about this as perhaps the attacks continue to grow once we get closer to the election cycle.
Gotcha. Thank you for that. And we're going to finish off with one reader question in sort of a rapid fire way. We started this discussion talking about the DNC, which is this week. Jonathan told us about how in a lot of ways it's a coronation, it's more of a celebration. But we had a reader who asked, what is your wildest DNC prediction? What would you like to see happen, whether that's from the politicians or celebrities? So I want to go around the room, and if anyone can just predict one thing about the DNC, and we'll wrap up.
I'm going to predict more people watch the DNC on TikTok than on NBC News, let's say. The DNC is really making a play to try and meet young people where they are this year. They announced that they will have vertical streaming, meaning they will have video feeds coming out of the convention specifically designed for cell phone viewing. For TikTok and other platforms that use that video orientation. So I think we're going to see a lot of folks, to the extent young people care about politics, we'll see a lot of folks watching on TikTok, whatever that means.
Perfect.
This is an interesting question. I do predict that we're going to see a big presence from Black women from Michigan being there and being a big part of this. And really rising to the top as supporters for the Harris campaign. I think I'm already seeing it. So I expect them to be a key part of the crowd taking part in the festivities.
Lauren?
Yeah, I would also, to piggyback off of that, I would just watch for Michigan's presence here at the DNC. It's a battleground state. Certainly everyone who's been following politics here has heard that one before. But, certainly a lot of our high profile officials are going to be there, some with speaking slots. And, I think Michigan will be pretty well represented all around.
Thanks. So maybe TikTok, presence of Black women voters there, and then in general Michigan voters at the DNC. We will be following the DNC all week, and you can check our elections tracker at bridgemi.com for updates. Our website also has a nonpartisan voter guide as well as regular updates about the election. If you have a question for our reporters, you can submit that at bridgemi.com. We're excited that you spent part of your morning here. And if you want even more political news, you can go to bridgemi.com/sign-up to sign up for our free Politics Watch newsletter. Thank you so much for watching Bridge Elections FAQ. We'll be back next week.